Hey guys, and welcome to this lesson. Today I'm going to talk about how each chess piece moves around on the board. I'll start off with the simple moves as a bit of a review, and then move on to the special moves, such as castling, that can give newer players a massive advantage over their opponent. So without further ado, let's get started. So the first piece I want to talk about is the pawn. In most cases, the pawn is the weakest piece in chess, which is why you start with 8 of them instead of 1 or 2. Pawns move 1 square up the board each move, but have special rules regarding capturing. Usually, to capture an opponent's piece, you move one of your pieces like normal onto the square with the opponent's piece already on it. Every piece in chess follows this rule except for pawns. To capture with a pawn, you have to move it diagonally upwards to the right or left. This gives the pawns the ability to move sideways, but only when capturing another piece. It also means your pawns can get stuck in front of other pieces. Pawns also have more special rules you should be taking advantage of, which I'll talk about later. The next piece is the knight. The knight is the only piece in chess that can move through other pieces. To remember this, you can think of the knight being able to jump over the other pieces on the board because it's on horseback. The movement pattern of a knight is also a little different than the other pieces. Knights move in an L shape, either 2 squares horizontally and 1 square vertically, or vice versa. That sounds complicated, but that just means that every time you move your knight, it makes an L shape on the board. To give you a visual, on the board I have a knight in the center, and all the squares it can go to are highlighted in red. The next piece is the bishop. The bishop moves diagonally any number of squares each move. This makes it more mobile than the knight, as it can go from one end of the board to the other in one move, whereas the knight would have to take 4. However, because bishops only move diagonally, they cannot leave the color square they start on. For example, this bishop can never leave the dark squares, so during the entire game, it can only attack pieces that my opponent puts on the dark squares. Next up is the rook. The rook moves in a straight line any number of squares, kind of like the bishop. The difference between the rook and the bishop is that the rook moves up and down instead of diagonally. This means that the rook can switch what color square it lands on each move. Rooks are also involved with a special move that I'll talk about later. Next is the queen. The queen has the same movement as the rook and the bishop put together, making the queen the strongest piece in the game, which is why you only get one of her to start with. The last piece is the king. The king is the most valuable piece in the game, because you can't lose your king without losing the game. The king moves 1 square in any direction each move, but remember, you can't move your king into check. The king is also involved in a special move, which I'll talk about later. Okay, now that we reviewed the basics, let's talk about the more complicated moves. These are pawns moving an additional square on the first move, pawn promotion moves, en passant, and castling. Let's start with pawns moving an additional square. If you haven't already figured it out, pawns are very slow. They move 1 square at a time and can even get stuck in front of other pieces. Therefore, there is a rule that the pawn can move 2 squares instead of 1, but only on its first move. Every pawn can take advantage of this. However, this only applies to moving, not capturing, so you cannot take advantage of this rule to capture a piece that is farther away. The reason you should be using this rule is because pawns are excellent at taking space, which is how much room you have to move your pieces around. If you move your pawn up 2 squares instead of 1 square at the beginning of the game, your pawn is going to take up more space, and is going to take space from your opponent. The next special move is pawn promotion. If you can get your pawn down to the other end of the board, you can make it into a better piece as a reward for your efforts. The way this works is that if you move a pawn onto the very opposite side of the board, you can immediately replace the piece with a different one, which usually ends up being the queen, since it's the strongest piece. Doing this is part of the move, so you don't have to wait or spend another turn to promote the pawn, but it is mandatory, so you can't just leave the pawn as is on the other side of the board. Pawns also have another special move called en passant. En passant is French for in passing, which makes sense once you see what en passant is. To do an en passant, you must have a pawn on the 5th rank, those are the left to right rows on the board, if you're playing as white, or 4th rank if you're playing as black. If you aren't sure which rank your pawn's on, most chessboards have numbers on them to tell you which ranks are which. Just make sure you set the pieces up on the board properly, with white's pieces being on ranks 1 and 2, and black's pieces being on ranks 7 and 8. Otherwise, everything will be flipped, and we don't want that. Anyways, if your pawn is in the correct position, and your opponent uses the rule we talked about before to move their pawn up 2 squares, if your pawn is beside it for 1 move, and 1 move only, you can capture your opponent's pawn as if it only moved 1 square. However, if you choose not to, you lose your opportunity to do this for the rest of the game. En passant is probably the most complicated move in the game, and it's also very rare, but it's still important to know so that you don't make a mistake. The final special move in chess is castling. Castling is an extremely important concept that is often what divides a beginner level player from an intermediate level player, so pay close attention. Castling involves the king and either one of the rooks, but, and this is really important, the king and the rook you're using cannot have moved at all before you try to castle. This means if you move the king around at the beginning of the game, you cannot castle for the rest of the game. To actually perform a castle, you take the king and move it 2 squares towards the rook. Then take the rook and move it to the other side of the king. Depending on which rook you used, you should have a position that looks like this. There are several criteria you have to meet to castle, which are: you cannot castle through check, meaning at no point during the move can an enemy piece be attacking your king. You cannot castle into check, meaning your king cannot be attacked once you're done with the castle. And you cannot castle out of check, so no using it to run away. I forgot to mention it, but there's also a 4th criteria, which is that the spaces in between your king and your rook have to be clear. You can't have any pieces on them in order for you to be able to castle. Because if you had pieces on them, then your king and your rook would move through them, and you can't capture your own piece, so it wouldn't really make sense. Now, the reason that castling is better than leaving your king in the center of the board is that it's safer. Castling gives your king a protective shield of 3 pawns and a rook, and also takes it away from the center of the board, which is usually where most of the action is going to be happening during the game. Okay, that's going to be it for me today, but before I go, I just want to say that the best way to practice the special moves like castling is to use them right away. So if you can, during your next game, you should give some of the special moves a try. If you get it wrong, then it's okay, you learn and move on, but if you get it right, it could potentially win you the game, and many more in the future. With that being said, thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next lesson.